What's up guys, Doe here, and yesterday I posted a video about a repeater guide, and today I'll be giving y'all a build and some variations to the same build that I used in yesterday's video. But let's go ahead and get right to the build. We're going to have the Austrian repeaters with the full bore chamber, captain's grip, searing prism, and lucky magazine. And I'm selecting all these pieces because I want to get as much damage as I can get without sacrificing other aspects. And all these pieces work really well together, and they're pretty much going to be the best in slot for their categories, minus some other oddball situations. But for my gear, I have the Drask helmet, which is pretty easy to get really early on, and then for everything else I'm going to have Koshai. So Koshai chest, Koshai gloves, and then Koshai feet. And the reason I'm selecting all this gear is because the Koshai pieces have Predator, Evasive Fury, and some more Predator, and those are insanely good sells to the repeaters. And later on, I'll be showing you guys why this build is very nice because it's very modular, and you can swap out some pieces while keeping the main structure of the build the same in terms of perks. And also, the last piece of this build is going to be the Drask's Eye Lantern, and this lantern is chosen because of the instant cast, which gives you extra damage for 6 seconds, and the hold to cast, which is a lightning bolt that's very easy to channel and use and just get almost instantaneous damage out of, and not having to wait for it to explode or to have a behemoth stay in a certain area. So all in all, the instant cast and the hold to cast work really well together, and I like this lantern a lot for the repeaters. Now, with all that said and done, the perks of this build will be +6 Etheric Attunement, Conduit, Evasive Fury, Overpower, and Predator. And I'll have 1 +3 Swift. So when all said and done, this is pretty much the best perk economy you can have. Not the best perks, but the best perk economy. Because you have 5 +6 perks, and that's the most you can possibly have on repeaters as it currently stands. And all the perks I selected are pretty much really good on most fights. And for the fights that they are really good on, it's going to be on fights that have an interrupt window or a boop window, and that are also very high intensity for dodging. Now, to explain why these factors are important, I'm going to go ahead and start off with the boop/interrupt window. And that's a really big factor for this build because you have Overpower. Overpower is active during a stagger, which repeaters cannot do stagger damage, or on a boop/interrupt, and on a part break, which repeaters can do. Now, the reason why having an interrupt window is really important is because interrupts can happen very early on in the fight, whereas a part break won't happen for a while because you have to hit the part a lot to break it. And the reason why dodge intensive fights are important is because of Evasive Fury. So Evasive Fury is procced off of dodging an attack. And some behemoths can be sort of high intensity for dodging, but at the same time they have a lot of phases where they run away and they're doing something else. And the fights that I would suggest this build being really good on are going to be Stormclaw, Scrave, Moonriver Strike, and Ragetoll Gnasher. And the reason why I mentioned Stormclaw and Scrave is because those behemoths will be getting a dire version/heroic version in the future. Windhorn Scrave is already confirmed, and it looks sick, by the way. If you haven't seen it, go check out some of the live stream on the Nintendo Treehouse event because it looks dope, and I cannot wait for this fight. And for Stormclaw, it's going to get a dire version. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet, but it will be getting one in the future. Anyway, playing this build is going to be pretty straightforward. All you really have to do is try and get to 0 bullets and then use your full bore chamber during an overpowered state. So that's during a part break or an interrupt. And honestly, it's much easier said than done. And it is much easier in a group, by the way, because if you're in a group and your friend's playing at a hammer or an axe or a sword, things that do stagger damage, if they trigger a stagger, that makes it much easier on yourself to actually do the damage you want to do really easily. Otherwise, you have to, break apart or interrupt, and that can be a pain. But even still, this build is still somewhat hard to use, and I get that. And because of that, you can do a couple of things to this very build, such as changing out the mod for Extraction Catalyst, which makes it so every time you dodge, you get reduction to your cooldowns for your right click and your Q, which is your heavy attack and your special, by 2 seconds. And this works super good on Gnasher. Other fights, it's okay, but on Gnasher, Ragetoll Gnasher, it's very, very good. But if you want to go even further than that, if you don't like Overpower on these fights, you can actually swap it out for Rage Hunter very seamlessly pretty much. All you do is change out the power slots from Overpower to Rage Hunter, and then Bob's your auntie, you got Rage Hunter, which is active for a pretty long duration of time, especially in comparison to Overpower. And this will make it so you can get off your full bore chamber in a much easier manner and not have to worry about just shooting it because Overpower is happening. And for some advice, I would say that if you're playing in a group that's not experienced or just new players in general, I would play Rage Hunter over Overpower. Because Overpower is as good as you are, whereas Rage Hunter happens if a behemoth, takes enough damage to trigger an enrage, and that's going to be up for a long time. Overpower is not so simple. You have to, like I keep saying, trigger a stagger, break apart, or trigger an interrupt. And doing these things takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of knowledge of the behemoth. If you're playing in a group, it's a lot harder to do these things, especially if they are not experienced players. So basically, Overpower is more of a tryhard sell for repeaters especially, whereas Rage Hunter is a much more safe sell that is still pretty effective. Moving on, if you want to have even more modularity, you can change out the gloves from Koshai to Hellion gloves, and then swap out the technique slot and the repeaters from Evasive Fury to Molten, and that gives you +6 Molten, effectively taking away the +6 Evasive Fury. And Molten is very good on fights where Evasive Fury is still effective, but just doesn't maintain as much uptime. And just to be clear, Molten only gives you 20% attack speed, whereas Evasive Fury gives you 25% at +6. And Molten is a better choice, especially on fights like Riftstalker, on Shroud, and Rezakiri in my opinion, just because those fights, those behemoths will walk away or run away, and you can't trigger Evasive Fury unless they're hitting you. But Molten is based on hitting a behemoth every so often to proc Molten Hearts, and Molten Hearts will give you attack speed, movement speed, and fire immunity. And for the behemoths I prefer Molten on instead of Evasive Fury, I'm going to go ahead and say Rezakiri, Frostback Pangar, Dreadfrost Boreas, Razorwing Kaerbaek, Riftstalker, Shroud, Scorchstone Hellion for sure, and Firebrand Charog. And again, these are behemoths I actually like fighting with repeaters as well, because there are others I could list, but these are the behemoths I like fighting with repeaters. Other behemoths, not so much. And if you are using Molten, 2 suggestions. The first one is to proc it as soon as you can, and the second one is to watch out for Molten thieves, including myself, because Molten is a hot commodity on the Shattered Isles. If you got it, someone wants it, they're going to take it, you got to protect it. So that's a disclaimer, but using this build doesn't really change depending on yourselves. It's pretty much the same thing. You want to have attack speed, and you want to have a lot of damage. And if you want, you can swap out the full bore chamber, which is going to be the best in slot chamber for damage on most fights. Exceptions are going to be for Riftstalker for sure, and a couple other small behemoths. But if you want to swap out full bore chamber, I would suggest using the salvo chamber, not ballistic. The salvo chamber, mostly because it's just easier to use. The full bore chamber requires you to be at the front of the behemoth shooting from the head to the tail for maximum DPS, and it also requires longer behemoths, whereas the salvo chamber does not require any of those things, and instead you just have to hit the behemoth. And you should be hitting the parts to try and get some more part damage in to break the part, but if you don't care about min-maxing or any of that stuff, then just hit the behemoth and that's all you really have to do. And for the final variation, let's go ahead and try and get some Aether Hunter when we're fighting Riftstalker and Shroud. And to do that, all you need to really do is swap out the chest piece and the feet. So swap out the chest piece for the Charog chest and the feet for Valamir. And that will give you Aether Hunter, and you can keep the exact same slots because it's the exact same cell pieces, and try and keep Overpower in the head and gloves of this build. So for the Jurassic Helmet, keep Overpower in the cell slot, and for the gloves, do the same thing. And by the way, for the gloves, I do suggest using the Hellion gloves to get more Molten to have +6, because Molten is my cell of preference on Riftstalker and Shroud because they like to run away sometimes, and Molten's duration stacks. If you pick up more orbs, every time you pick up more orbs, it'll stack the duration, and you can have an insanely long duration, whereas Evasive Fury only lasts 16 seconds every time you dodge. You can refresh the duration, but you cannot stack it like you can with Molten. And to quickly explain why I suggest Aether Hunter on these fights instead of Rage Hunter is because for Riftstalker, it's only in Rage during its Fidget Spinner move of death. Whenever it's like, spinning around through the portals, that is in Rage mode. And you can't really do much damage during that mode on most weapons, like at all really. Whereas Aether Hunter is active pretty much the whole fight. Riftstalker actually starts the fight off in Aether mode at the very beginning. Whenever it does that weird animation where it turns purple, that's Aether mode, and that's active for pretty much the whole fight. Shroud, on the other hand, doesn't go in Aether mode as often, but it's still more relevant than going in Rage. Because Shroud's in Rage during its Dark mode. Whenever everything goes pitch black, that's Shroud's in Rage. If you interrupt it out of that mode during its Glide attack, it goes out of in Rage, but it'll stay in Aether mode. And that's why Aether Hunter is better. Plus, Aether Hunter gives 10% more damage than Rage Hunter now, so on these two behemoths, Aether Hunter is just better. And the final thing I want to discuss is going to be the consumables for repeaters. So if you're fighting a behemoth that has an interruptible attack, for sure bring concussive grenades. It is highly recommended you do this because repeaters can interrupt without these, but it's just not very viable or effective on fights that are very boop intensive. And I'll also bring the Aether Drop Tonic, which gives you 100% extra lantern generation, and then the Frenzy Tonic, which gives you 15% damage increase for just using it, and an extra 15% damage if a behemoth enrages. And if I'm not using the concussive grenades, I will instead bring Blitz Tonic, which gives you 10% attack speed, and you'll get an additional 20% health if you're basically at 0 health. If you're at like a very small amount of health, you'll get an extra 20 stacks, and those 20 stacks gives you an extra 20% attack speed. And more attack speed is always welcomed on repeaters. But y'all, that is pretty much the build that I like using a lot recently, and the variations to the same build. And that's pretty much all I've got for today, so thank y'all again for watching. If you liked it, please leave a like, it does help out the channel immensely. If you want to subscribe to this channel for more Dauntless content, so what I do here primarily. And I am a Dauntless partner on Twitch, So if you want to, check me out there. I stream pretty often every Wednesday through Saturday from 7 p.m. Central to 11 p.m. Central, and I basically just answer a ton of questions and show off how to play a lot of weapons on Dauntless and how to use certain spells properly. But if you want to support this channel, you can use my Epic Games support code, which is going to be OhDough in the Epic Games store, or when you're buying things off Dauntless, because it does support me. And again, thank y'all for doing that. But that's the end, and thank y'all again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.